They thought she was just a broken old woman. Weak, silent, easy to control. They took everything from her. Her home, her dignity, the life she built for 40 years with the man she loved. And she never said a word. She just watched. But here's what they didn't know. Margaret wasn't broken. She was calculating. And the quiet ones, they're the most dangerous. Because while her children were celebrating their betrayal, dividing up her furniture, laughing over wine in her living room, Margaret was in that tiny room they shoved her into, holding a stack of documents her late husband had hidden decades ago, papers that would change everything. You see, this isn't just another sad story about family betrayal. This is about a woman who was underestimated her entire life, who played the role they expected her to play until the exact moment she didn't. And when she struck back, it wasn't with screaming, it wasn't with tears, it was with stone-cold precision. Imagine this. You've just stolen your mother's house. You've manipulated the paperwork, forged signatures, transferred ownership while she grieved. You feel untouchable. Then one day, she invites you to dinner, says she forgives you, says she just wants the family together one last time. You show up smiling, and instead of food on the table, there are legal documents. Your name, your signature, your crime, laid out in black and white. The house, it was never theirs to take. And now they're the ones with nothing. This is Margaret's story, and trust me, you've never seen a revenge this quiet, this devastating, or this perfect. Stay with me, because what happens next will make you rethink everything you know about family, loyalty, and the power of a woman who refuses to be erased. Margaret's husband, Robert, died on a Tuesday. It was sudden, a heart attack in the garden while he was planting tomatoes. One moment, he was laughing at something on the radio. The next, silence. For 40 years, they'd built a life together, a modest home on the edge of town, 3 children, countless memories stitched into every corner of that house. The kitchen where they danced on anniversaries, the porch where they watched sunsets, the bedroom where they whispered dreams into the dark. And now he was gone. Margaret didn't scream, she didn't collapse. She just stood there in the doorway, watching the paramedics shake their heads, and felt her entire world tilt sideways. The funeral was beautiful. Her children were there. David, Rachel, and Linda, all dressed in black, all saying the right things. They hugged her, told her they'd take care of everything, told her she wouldn't be alone. And for a few days, Margaret believed them. But grief has a way of revealing people's true faces. It started small. David suggested she simplify her living situation. Rachel mentioned that the house was too big for one person. Linda kept asking about paperwork, insurance policies, the deed, bank accounts. Margaret was too numb to question it. She trusted them. They were her children. So when David said, "Mom, just sign here. It's for the estate taxes," she signed. When Rachel said, "We need to update the house title for legal reasons," she nodded. When Linda said, "Dad would have wanted this handled quickly," Margaret believed her. She signed paper after paper, barely reading, her hands shaking, her mind clouded with loss. And that's when everything changed. 2 weeks after the funeral, David sat her down at the kitchen table, her kitchen table, and said the words that would shatter her. "Mom, we've decided it's best if you move into the guest room. We're going to be managing the house now. It's just easier this way." Margaret blinked. "What do you mean, managing the house?" Rachel stepped in, voice sweet but firm. "The house is technically in our names now, Mom. You signed the transfer papers. We thought it would be easier for you, less responsibility." The room spun. I signed a transfer?" Linda folded her arms. "You weren't thinking clearly. We did what was best for everyone." Margaret's voice cracked. "This is my home." David's face hardened. "Not anymore." And just like that, she became a guest in the house she'd lived in for 4 decades. They moved her into the smallest room, the one that used to be a storage closet. 1 bed, 1 lamp, a narrow window that barely let in light. Meanwhile, her children redecorated. New furniture, new paint. They even took down the photos of Robert. Her heard them laughing in the living room at night, heard them toasting to their smart planning, heard them discuss selling off her belongings. And every night, alone in that tiny room, Margaret cried. But here's the thing about people who cry in silence. They're not always crying because they're weak. Sometimes they're crying because they're thinking. And Margaret, she was thinking about a conversation she'd had with Robert years ago, about documents he kept hidden, about promises she made her swear to remember. And late one night, while her children slept in her bed, in her house, Margaret opened an old drawer Robert had told her never to touch unless she absolutely had to. Inside, she found everything, and she smiled for the first time in weeks. The documents were wrapped in plastic, buried under old tax records and faded receipts. At first, Margaret didn't even know what she was looking at. There were photocopies of the original house deed, bank statements, notarized letters, and a handwritten note from Robert dated just 3 months before he died. It read, "Margaret, if you're reading this, something's happened to me. I need you to know the house is yours. I never put the kids on the title. I never planned to. I saw how they looked at us these last few years, like we were in the way, like we were their inheritance. I won't let them take what we built. There's a lawyer. His card is in this envelope. If they ever try anything, call him. He has copies of everything. I love you. Protect yourself." Margaret's hands trembled as she unfolded the lawyer's business card. James Whitaker, Estate and Property Law. Her heart pounded. She read the note again, then again. Robert had known. He'd seen it coming, the manipulation, the greed, the betrayal, and he'd protected her, even from beyond the grave. But now came the hard part. She had to stay silent, because if her children knew she had this information, they'd find a way to bury it. They'd gaslight her, intimidate her, maybe even destroy the documents. No, Margaret had to be smart. So she did something that would have shocked anyone who thought they knew her. She played along. The next morning, she shuffled into the kitchen where Rachel was drinking coffee, scrolling through her phone. "Good morning, sweetheart," Margaret said softly. Rachel barely looked up. "Morning." "I was thinking maybe I could help around the house, cleaning, cooking. I don't want to be a burden." Rachel smirked. "Sure, Mom, whatever makes you feel useful." Margaret smiled weakly and turned away. But inside, she was boiling. Over the next few weeks, Margaret became invisible. She cooked their meals, washed their dishes, stayed out of their way. She played the role of the grateful, defeated mother who'd accepted her fate. David and Rachel started leaving legal documents on the counter, bills, property tax statements, even discussions about selling the house for profit. They didn't bother hiding anything anymore. Why would they? Margaret was harmless. But every night, after they went to bed, Margaret sat in that tiny room and read through Robert's documents. She memorized every detail. She studied property law on the old computer in the corner. She prepared. And then, one afternoon, she made the call. "Whitaker Law Offices, how can I help you?" Margaret's voice was steady. "My name is Margaret Lawson. My husband, Robert Lawson, was a client of James Whitaker. I need to speak with him." There was a pause. Then, "Please hold." 30 seconds later, a deep, calm voice came on the line. "Mrs. Lawson, I've been waiting for your call." Margaret exhaled. "You knew? Your husband made me promise to keep everything sealed unless you reached out. He said you'd know when the time was right, and I'm guessing the time is right." "Yes. Tell me everything." And she did. She told him about the forged signatures, the manipulated paperwork, the way her children had stolen her home while she was drowning in grief. James Whittaker listened without interrupting. Then he said something that made Margaret's spine straighten. "Mrs. Lawson, your husband made sure the house could never be taken from you. Every document they have is invalid, and if they've been living there under false pretenses, we can not only get your house back, but we can make sure they face consequences." Margaret closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she felt powerful. "What do I need to do?" "Leave that to me. But Mrs. Lawson, are you ready for this? Because once we move, there's no going back." Margaret didn't hesitate. "I'm ready." The plan had to be perfect. James Whittaker explained it carefully over the phone, his voice calm and clinical, like a surgeon prepping for a delicate operation. "We have two options," he said. "We can file immediately, force them out with a court order, make it public and messy, or, Margaret asked, "or we let them think they've won, let them get comfortable, and then we serve them in a way they'll never forget." Margaret thought about the smug look on David's face when he told her the house wasn't hers anymore, the way Rachel had redecorated her bedroom without asking, the way Linda had sold her mother's jewelry, Robert's gifts, and bought herself a new car. "I want them to feel it," Margaret said quietly. James paused. Then, with a hint of admiration in his voice, "Then we do this my way." Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret played her role flawlessly. She was the obedient mother, the grateful houseguest. She made their breakfast, folded their laundry, and asked for nothing. David started talking openly about selling the house. "We could get at least $400,000 for this place," he said one night at dinner, as if Margaret wasn't even there. "Split 3 ways, that's a nice chunk of change." Rachel nodded. "We should list it in the spring. The market's hot." Linda glanced at Margaret. "You're okay with this, right, Mom? I mean, you understand it's what's best." Margaret smiled softly. "Of course, sweetheart. I just want you all to be happy." Linda looked almost guilty for a second. Almost. But Margaret saw the relief in her eyes, the satisfaction, the belief that their mother had finally accepted her place. Good. Let them believe it. Meanwhile, James Whittaker was moving pieces behind the scenes like a chess master. He filed a quiet injunction with the county clerk's office, freezing any future transactions on the property. He contacted the notary who'd allegedly witnessed Margaret's signatures and discovered she'd been out of the country on the dates the documents were signed. Forgery, clear as day. He compiled affidavits, title records, and Robert's original will, which explicitly stated the house was to remain in Margaret's name, with no transfer of ownership to the children unless she voluntarily chose to sell. Everything her children had done, illegal. But James didn't file the lawsuit. Not yet. Instead, he called Margaret. "It's time," he said, "but I need you to do something that might feel uncomfortable." "What?" "I need you to invite them to dinner." Margaret frowned. "Dinner?" "Yes, a family dinner. Tell them you've been thinking about everything and you want to clear the air. Maybe even say you're ready to sign over any remaining claims, just to keep the peace. Make it emotional. Make it believable." Margaret's stomach twisted. "You want me to lie to them?" "I want you to give them exactly what they gave you, Mrs. Lawson, a trap disguised as kindness." She closed her eyes, took a breath. "When?" "This Friday. I'll be there with the papers. They won't see me coming." Margaret hung up the phone and stared at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror on the wall. She looked older than she remembered, tired, small. But her eyes were sharp. That evening, she walked into the living room where her children were watching TV. "Kids," she said softly, "I'd like to make dinner this Friday. All of us, Together. I've been thinking a lot, and I just want us to be a family again." David looked suspicious. "What's the occasion?" Margaret smiled, her voice fragile and sweet. "No occasion. I just miss you, and I want to let go of all this tension. Life's too short, you know?" Rachel and Linda exchanged glances. Then Rachel shrugged. "Sure, Mom, that sounds nice." Linda nodded. "Yeah, we'd like that." David hesitated, then finally said, "Okay, Friday." Margaret smiled wider. "Perfect. I'll make your favorite, pot roast." As she turned and walked back to her little room, her heart pounded in her chest, because this wasn't just dinner, this was justice, and they had no idea what was coming. Friday came slowly. Margaret barely slept the night before. She kept imagining how it would go, what they'd say, how they'd react, whether they'd beg or rage or crumble. Part of her felt guilt creeping in. These were her children. She'd raised them, loved them, sacrificed for them. But then she remembered the look on David's face when he told her the house wasn't hers anymore. The coldness, the entitlement, and the guilt melted away. By Friday afternoon, the house smelled like pot roast, garlic, and fresh bread, just like it used to when Robert was alive. David arrived first, dressed casually, phone in hand. He barely looked at her. "Smells good, Mom." Rachel came next, holding a bottle of wine she'd clearly grabbed from the grocery store on the way. "Thought we'd celebrate," she said with a tight smile. Linda was last, wearing expensive sunglasses and a new coat Margaret had never seen before, paid for with stolen jewelry, no doubt. They settled into the dining room, her dining room, laughing, pouring wine, acting like everything was perfectly normal. Margaret brought out the food and set it on the table. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, roasted carrots, all their favorites. "This looks amazing, Mom," Linda said, serving herself a large portion. "Yeah, just like old times," Rachel added. David raised his glass. "To family." They clinked glasses. Margaret didn't drink. "Actually," she said, her voice steady and calm, "there's something I need to show you." Rachel frowned. "What do you mean?" Margaret walked to the kitchen and returned holding a large manila envelope. The room went still. "What's that?" David asked, his tone suddenly cautious. Margaret placed the envelope on the table, right next to the pot roast. "These," she said quietly, "are the real documents." Linda's face paled. "Mom, what are you—" "The house was never yours," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. "The papers you made me sign? Fraudulent. The signatures? Forged. The notary? Out of the country when you claimed I signed." Rachel stood up. "Mom, you're confused." "I'm not confused." Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. "I know exactly what you did. You stole from me while I was grieving. You manipulated me. You erased me." David's jaw tightened. "We were protecting you. You were robbing me." The doorbell rang. Everyone froze. Margaret walked to the door and opened it. James Whittaker stepped inside, tall and composed, carrying a leather briefcase. Behind him were two uniformed sheriff's deputies. David shot to his feet. "What the hell is this?" James set his briefcase on the table and opened it, pulling out a stack of legal documents. "My name is James Whittaker. I'm Mrs. Lawson's attorney, and these are eviction notices, cease and desist orders, and formal fraud complaints filed with the district attorney's office." Rachel's face went white. "You can't." "I can," James said coolly, "and I have. This house belongs to Margaret Lawson. It always has. Your mother never legally transferred ownership. Every document you forged, every signature you faked, every lie you told, it's all documented here." He slid copies of the documents across the table. "You have 72 hours to vacate the property. Any belongings you've acquired using funds from fraudulent sales of Mrs. Lawson's property, jewelry, furniture, etc., are subject to seizure and legal restitution." Linda's voice trembled. "Mom, please." Margaret looked at her daughter, the girl she'd rocked to sleep, the woman she'd watched grow, and felt nothing. "You had a choice," she said quietly. "You could have loved me, supported me, honored your father's memory." Her voice turned to ice. "Instead, you treated me like I was already dead." David slammed his fist on the table. "This is insane. We're your children." "And I was your mother," Margaret said. "But you forgot that the moment you decided I was worth less than a house." James closed his briefcase. "The deputies are here to ensure a peaceful transition. I suggest you start packing." Rachel burst into tears. Linda stared at the floor. David looked like he wanted to explode, but knew he had no ground to stand on. Margaret turned and walked toward the door. "Enjoy your dinner," she said softly, and she left them there, stunned, speechless, and powerless, exactly how they left her. Margaret didn't stay to watch them pack. She spent that night in a hotel, a quiet little place on the edge of town with clean sheets and a view of the hills. It was the first time in weeks she'd slept without fear, without anger clawing at her chest. For the first time since Robert died, she felt like herself again. The next morning, James Whitaker called. "They're gone," he said. "Left last night. David tried to argue with the deputies, but they escorted him out. The locks have been changed. The house is secure." Margaret exhaled slowly. "And the legal side?" "The DA's office is reviewing the fraud case. Given the evidence, it's likely they'll face charges, at minimum civil penalties and restitution. But Margaret," he paused, "they're your children. If you want to drop the criminal complaint, you still can." Margaret stared out the hotel window at the morning light spilling over the hills. She thought about the years she'd spent raising them, the scraped knees she'd bandaged, the school plays she'd attended, the late nights she'd stayed up helping with homework. She thought about all the love she'd poured into them. And then she thought about the way David had looked at her when he told her the house wasn't hers anymore, the way Rachel had taken down Robert's photos, the way Linda had sold her jewelry without asking. "No," Margaret said quietly. "Let the case move forward." James was silent for a moment, then understood. That afternoon, Margaret returned to her house. Her house. She stood in the doorway for a long time, just breathing it in. The familiar creak of the floorboards, the way the light came through the kitchen window, the scent of old wood and memories. It felt like coming home after a long, terrible journey. She walked through each room slowly. David had left the master bedroom a mess, clothes everywhere, drawers hanging open. Rachel had taken most of the kitchen equipment. Linda had stripped the guest room bare. But the bones of the house were still there. The walls Robert had painted, the porch they'd built together, the garden where he'd died. It was still hers. Over the next few weeks, Margaret began to rebuild. She cleaned out every trace of her children, donated the furniture they'd bought, repainted the walls in soft, warm colors. She hung up old photos of Robert, images they'd tried to erase. And slowly, the house stopped feeling like a crime scene. It started feeling like a home again. Friends from church reached out when they heard what happened. Some were horrified. Others weren't surprised. "I always thought something was off about the way they talked about you," one woman said gently over tea. "Like you were an obligation, not a person." Margaret nodded. She'd felt that too, for years. But now she was free. One evening, Margaret sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. She thought about Robert, about the life they'd built, about the way he'd protected her even after death. "Thank you," she whispered into the quiet. A breeze moved through the garden, rustling the tomato plants Robert had started before he died. Margaret smiled. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't broken. She was surviving. And more than that, she was living. Because here's the thing people don't talk about enough. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't forgiveness. It's boundaries.
It's saying, "No, you don't get to treat me like this." It's standing up even when your voice shakes and taking back what's yours. Margaret had done that, and now, sitting on her porch in her house, she realized something powerful. She didn't need them. She'd spent so long believing that family was everything, that love meant enduring anything, that being a good mother meant sacrificing herself. But Robert had taught her something better. Love isn't sacrifice, it's respect, and her children hadn't respected her. So she let them go, not with hatred, but with clarity. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt light.
Word spread quickly in a small town. Margaret had expected judgment. She thought people would call her cruel, heartless, a mother who'd abandoned her children. But that's not what happened. Instead, women started reaching out to her. At first, it was just a quiet conversation at the grocery store. An older woman named Claire touched her arm gently and said, "I heard what you did. I'm proud of you." Margaret blinked, surprised. "You are?" Claire nodded, her eyes sad but knowing. "My son did something similar after my husband died, took control of everything. I didn't fight it. I didn't know I could. I wish I'd been as brave as you." Then there was Susan, a woman from her book club who pulled her aside at the library. "I just wanted you to know," Susan said quietly, "you inspired me. I've been letting my daughter walk all over me for years. After I heard your story, I finally set boundaries. And you know what? She's angry, but I feel free." Margaret smiled softly. "Good. You deserve to feel free." More stories came. A woman whose family had drained her savings. A man whose children had put him in a nursing home against his will and sold his house. A widow who'd been gaslit into signing away her inheritance. They all reached out to Margaret, not for advice, but just to say, "Thank you for showing us it's okay to fight back." Margaret hadn't meant to become a symbol. She'd just been trying to survive. But somehow her story had given others permission to do the same. One afternoon, Margaret received a letter in the mail. It was from Linda. Her hands shook as she opened it. "Mom, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry. I was selfish. I was greedy. I convinced myself we were doing the right thing, that we were protecting you. But the truth is, I just wanted the money. I wanted the security, and I didn't care what it cost you. David and Rachel won't admit it. They're still angry. They think you betrayed us. But I know the truth. We betrayed you first. I don't expect you to let me back into your life. I don't deserve that. But I want you to know I'm ashamed, and I'm sorry. Linda." Margaret read the letter 3 times. She felt a flicker of something. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe possibility. She folded the letter carefully and set it on the kitchen table. She didn't write back, not because she was angry, but because she wasn't ready. And that was okay. Healing doesn't have a timeline, and sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is wait until you're ready, not when someone else demands it. Margaret's life began to shift in unexpected ways. She started volunteering at a local senior center, helping other elderly people navigate legal issues and financial abuse. She shared her story openly, and people listened. She even started a small support group, Silver Strength, they called it, for older adults dealing with family exploitation. It met every Thursday in the church basement. Sometimes 5 people showed up, sometimes 20. But every single one of them left feeling a little less alone. Margaret discovered something she hadn't expected. Her pain had purpose. What her children had done to her was terrible, cruel, unforgivable by many standards. But it had also woken something up inside her, a fierce, quiet strength she didn't know she had. And now she was using that strength to help others find theirs. One afternoon, after a particularly powerful support group meeting, an older man named Harold approached her. "You saved my life," he said simply. I was about to sign everything over to my son. I thought I had no choice, but you showed me I do." Margaret smiled, her eyes soft. "You always had a choice, Harold. You just needed someone to remind you." He nodded, tears in his eyes, and walked away. Margaret sat alone in the quiet church basement, the evening light filtering through the stained glass windows. She thought about Robert, about the house, about her children, and she realized something profound. She didn't need them to apologize. She didn't need them to understand. She only needed to know that she'd stood up for herself, and she had.
6 months passed. Margaret's life had transformed in ways she never imagined. The house felt alive again. She'd repainted the living room in a soft cream color, hung new curtains, and filled the space with plants, ferns, succulents, a little herb garden by the kitchen window. She started hosting dinners again, not for her children, but for her real family. The women from Silver Strength, the friends from church, the people who'd shown up for her when it mattered. Laughter filled the rooms again, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt seen. But the past had a way of creeping back in. One evening, there was a knock at the door. Margaret opened it cautiously. It was Rachel. She looked thinner, tired. Her makeup was smudged and her hands were shaking. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, can we talk?" Margaret didn't move. "Why are you here, Rachel?" "Because Rachel's voice cracked. "Because I miss you. Because I've been thinking about what we did, and I can't sleep. I can't eat. I keep seeing your face that night, and You what?" Margaret's voice was cold. "You feel guilty?" "Yes, God, yes. I feel horrible, Mom. I don't know what we were thinking. I don't know how we—" "You were thinking about money," Margaret said quietly. "You were thinking about yourselves, and you didn't care what it did to me." "I know," Rachel sobbed. "I know, and I hate myself for it." Margaret stood there, watching her daughter fall apart on her doorstep. Part of her wanted to reach out, to comfort her, to pull her into a hug like she used to when Rachel was small, but another part, the part that had been broken and rebuilt, knew better. "Rachel," Margaret said softly, "I appreciate you coming here. I do. But an apology doesn't undo what you did. It doesn't give me back the nights I cried alone in that tiny room. It doesn't erase the feeling of being erased by my own children." Rachel looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I know, but I want to make it right. Please, tell me how." Margaret took a deep breath. "You can't," she said gently. "There's no making it right. There's only moving forward. And right now, I need to move forward without you." Rachel's face crumpled. "So that's it? You're just going to cut me out forever?" "I'm not cutting you out. I'm protecting myself. There's a difference." She stepped back and began to close the door. "Maybe one day," Margaret added, her voice softer now, "when you've actually changed, not just when you feel guilty, we can talk. But that day isn't today." And she closed the door. Rachel stood outside for a long moment, crying quietly. Then she left. Margaret leaned against the door, her heart pounding. It had taken everything in her not to let Rachel in, not to fall back into the old pattern of caretaking, of smoothing things over, of pretending everything was fine. But she'd done it. She'd held the boundary. And it hurt. God, it hurt. But it also felt right. Later that night, Margaret sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring up at the stars. She thought about all the versions of herself she'd been, the young bride who believed love conquered all, the mother who'd sacrificed everything for her children, the widow who'd been crushed by grief and betrayal, and now this, a woman who'd learned that love without respect is just control, a woman who'd learned that family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by how people treat you, a woman who'd learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away. Margaret pulled the blanket tighter and smiled into the night. She was proud of herself, and that was something no one could take from her.
Winter came quietly. The garden went dormant, the trees bare and skeletal against the gray sky. Margaret spent her days reading by the fireplace, knitting scarves for the women in her support group, and writing in a journal Robert had given her years ago. She wrote about everything: the betrayal, the fight, the healing, and slowly, page by page, she started to make sense of it all. One evening, she received another letter. This time, it was from David. She almost didn't open it, but curiosity won. "Mom, I'm not writing to apologize. I'm writing because I need you to understand. Dad left us nothing but that house. We worked hard our whole lives, and we watched you and Dad live comfortably while we struggled. When he died, we saw an opportunity. We took it. Was it wrong? Maybe. But don't act like you're some saint. You raised us to value security. You raised us to fight for what's ours. And that's exactly what we did. You want to play the victim? Fine. But we're the ones who lost everything. We're the ones dealing with legal fees, shame, judgment. You got your house back. Congratulations. I hope it was worth losing your family. David." Margaret read the letter twice. Then she walked to the fireplace and tossed it into the flames. She watched the paper curl and blacken, the words disappearing into ash. David didn't get it, and maybe he never would. He still thought this was about the house. But it wasn't. It was about being treated like she didn't matter, about being erased while she was still alive. David could justify it however he wanted, but Margaret knew the truth, and she didn't need his understanding. She only needed her own peace. That night, Margaret had a dream. She was standing in the garden, and Robert was there, kneeling by the tomato plants, just like he'd been the day he died. But this time, he looked up and smiled. "You did good, Maggie," he said softly. "I miss you," she whispered. "I know, but you don't need me anymore. You're stronger than you think." "I don't feel strong." Robert stood and walked over to her, his hand warm on her cheek. "Strength isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you are." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I did the right thing." "You stood up for yourself," Robert said gently. "That's always the right thing." And then he faded, like morning mist, leaving her alone in the garden. Margaret woke with tears on her face and a strange sense of calm in her chest. She didn't need Robert's permission. She didn't need her children's forgiveness. She only needed to trust herself. And she did. Spring arrived slowly, then all at once. The garden came back to life. Green shoots pushed through the soil, the trees budded, the air smelled like rain and fresh earth. Margaret spent hours outside, planting flowers, pulling weeds, talking to the plants like Robert used to. One afternoon, a car pulled into the driveway. Margaret's heart clenched. She thought it might be one of her children again. But it wasn't. It was Claire, the woman from the grocery store, who'd told her she was proud of her. "I hope I'm not intruding," Claire said, holding a basket of muffins. "I just thought maybe we could have tea." Margaret smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "I'd love that." They sat on the porch, sipping tea and talking about everything and nothing, about loss and strength and survival, and Margaret realized something beautiful. She'd lost her children, but she'd found herself, and she'd found a new kind of family, one built not on obligation, but on respect, kindness, and mutual support. It wasn't the family she'd imagined, but it was the family she needed, and that was enough. The legal case against her children moved slowly.
James Whittaker kept Margaret updated, but she tried not to think about it too much. The fraud charges had been filed. Restitution was being calculated. The courts would do what they'd do. Margaret had already won the only battle that mattered. She had her home. She had her dignity. She had her peace. But one day, James called with unexpected news. "Margaret, I need to tell you something. Linda reached out to my office. She wants to settle." Margaret frowned. "Settle?" "She's offering to pay restitution in full, everything she made from selling your belongings. She's also willing to make a formal apology on the record. In exchange, she's asking that you drop the criminal charges against her." Margaret was silent. "She's not asking for David or Rachel," James continued, "just herself. She said she wants to take accountability." Margaret closed her eyes. "What do you think I should do?" James paused. "That's not my decision, Margaret. But I'll say this. Criminal charges are about punishment. Restitution is about making things right. If Linda is genuinely trying to change, that might be worth more than a conviction." Margaret thought about Linda's first letter, the one that had said, "I'm sorry." She thought about Rachel's tears on the doorstep, and she thought about David's bitter letter blaming her for everything. 3 children, 3 completely different responses. "Set up a meeting," Margaret said finally. "I want to hear what she has to say, face to face." A week later, Margaret sat across from Linda in James Whittaker's office. Linda looked smaller than Margaret remembered. Her hair was pulled back simply, no designer coat, no expensive sunglasses, just a woman who looked tired and ashamed. "Thank you for meeting me," Linda said quietly. Margaret nodded but didn't speak. Linda took a shaky breath. "I've been in therapy, trying to figure out why I did what I did, and the truth is, I was jealous of you and Dad, of the life you built. I felt like I never measured up, like I was always chasing something I couldn't have." She looked down at her hands. "And when Dad died, I saw the house as my chance to finally have something solid, something that proved I was successful. But I didn't just take the house. I took your dignity, your sense of safety, and I can't undo that, but I want to try to make it right." Margaret studied her daughter's face. "Why now, Linda? Why not 6 months ago?" "Because 6 months ago I was still making excuses. I told myself you'd be fine, that you didn't really need the house, that we deserved it more. But the truth is, I knew it was wrong. I just didn't want to admit it." She pulled out a check and slid it across the table. "This is everything I made from selling your things, plus interest. It's not enough, I know that, but it's a start." Margaret looked at the check, then back at Linda. "I don't want your money, Linda." Linda's face fell. "Then what do you want?" Margaret leaned forward. "I want you to understand that love isn't about taking, it's about giving, and respect isn't optional, it's everything." Linda nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand." "Do you?" asked Margaret gently. "Because it's easy to say you're sorry. It's harder to actually change." "I know, but I'm trying. I swear I'm trying." Margaret looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll drop the charges, but I need time. I'm not ready to let you back into my life yet. Maybe one day, but not today." Linda nodded, relief and sadness mixing on her face. "I understand. Thank you, Mom." Margaret stood and walked toward the door. Then she paused and looked back. "Linda? Yeah? I hope you mean it. I really do." And she left.
The charges against Linda were dropped. David and Rachel's cases moved forward. David hired a lawyer and fought it aggressively. Rachel tried to negotiate, but had nothing to offer. Margaret stayed out of it. She'd said what she needed to say, done what she needed to do. Now it was up to the courts, and up to them. Life moved on. Margaret's support group grew. Silver Strength now met twice a week, and they'd started partnering with a local legal aid clinic to help seniors facing exploitation. Margaret became a quiet advocate, sharing her story at community centers and senior homes. "I'm not special," she'd say. "I'm just someone who refused to disappear." And people listened, because her story wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming yourself. One afternoon, Margaret was working in the garden when a young woman approached her. "Excuse me," the woman said nervously, "are you Margaret Lawson?" Margaret straightened, wiping dirt from her hands. "I am." "I'm Emily. I'm a journalist with the local paper. I've been hearing about your story, and I'd love to write about it, if you're willing." Margaret hesitated. She'd kept her head down for months, not wanting attention. But then she thought about all the people who'd reached out to her, all the people who'd said, "Your story gave me courage." "What would the article be about?" Margaret asked. Emily smiled. "About how family exploitation is more common than people think, about how elder abuse isn't always physical, it's emotional, psychological, and about how you fought back." Margaret thought about it, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but I want to make one thing clear." "What's that?" "This isn't about revenge. It's about survival and dignity." Emily's smile widened. "That's exactly the story I want to tell." The article came out 2 weeks later. "The Quiet Woman Who Took Back Her Life: One Widow's Fight Against Family Betrayal." It was featured on the front page of the local paper, and within days it had been picked up by regional outlets, then national ones. Margaret's phone rang constantly. Interview requests, speaking invitations, people wanting to share their own stories. She was overwhelmed, but also moved, because she realized her pain had become something bigger than herself. It had become a movement. Lawyers started reaching out, offering free clinics on estate planning and elder law. Advocacy groups invited her to speak. A nonprofit focused on elder abuse asked her to join their board. She said yes to the things that felt right and no to the things that didn't. She was learning that boundaries weren't just for family, they were for everything. One evening, Margaret was sitting on her porch when her phone buzzed. It was a text from Linda. "I saw the article. I'm proud of you, Mom. I mean it." Margaret stared at the message for a long time. Then she typed back, "Thank you." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a door left slightly open, and maybe that was enough. That night, Margaret stood in the kitchen where she and Robert had spent so many mornings together. She poured herself a cup of tea and looked around at the home they'd built. The home she'd fought for. The home she'd won. And she felt something she hadn't for a long, long time. Pride. Not the arrogant kind, but the quiet, steady kind. The kind that says, "I survived. I stood up. I matter." Margaret raised her cup toward the window, toward the stars, toward Robert. "We did it," she whispered. And somewhere, in the space between memory and hope, she could almost hear him whisper back, "I always knew you would." A year passed. Margaret's life had settled into a rhythm she never expected, but one she'd come to love. She still lived in the house, still tended the garden, still hosted dinners for her chosen family. But now she also traveled. She'd never traveled much when Robert was alive. There was always a reason not to. Money, time, the kids, responsibilities. But now? Now she was free. She visited national parks, took a train along the coast, spent a weekend in a small mountain town just because it looked peaceful. She sent postcards to the women in Silver Strength, writing little notes of encouragement. "You deserve joy. Go find it." And she meant it, because if Margaret had learned anything, it was this: life doesn't wait for permission, and neither should you. One afternoon, while Margaret was at a cafe in a town she'd never visited before, a woman approached her table. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said, shyly, "but are you Margaret Lawson, the woman from the article?" Margaret smiled. "I am." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted to thank you. I was in a similar situation with my family, and reading your story gave me the courage to get a lawyer. I just got my house back last week." Margaret's heart swelled. "I'm so proud of you." The woman wiped her eyes. "I don't know if I ever would have fought back if I hadn't read about you, so thank you, really." She walked away, and Margaret sat there, staring into her coffee, feeling the weight and beauty of it all. Her pain had mattered, not because it was unique, but because she'd used it. She'd turned her trauma into testimony, her suffering into strength, and now people she'd never met were standing up for themselves because she had. That evening, Margaret returned home to find an envelope in her mailbox, no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Dear Mrs. Lawson, you don't know me, but I know your story. I'm a 32-year-old woman, and I watched my grandmother go through something similar. She didn't fight back. She just faded, and I've carried guilt about that for years. But reading about you made me realize something. It wasn't her fault, and it wasn't my fault. It was theirs. Thank you for showing the world that quiet women aren't weak. They're just waiting for the right moment. With gratitude, a stranger who needed your story." Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer with all the others she'd received, dozens of them now, each one a reminder that her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been silenced, dismissed, or underestimated, and that was a legacy worth having. Later that night, Margaret sat in the living room looking at a photo of Robert on the mantel. "I wish you could see this," she said softly. "I wish you could see what we started." The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full, full of memories, full of strength, full of hope. Margaret had spent so much of her life trying to be what other people needed: the good wife, the good mother, the woman who never caused trouble. But now she was just Margaret, and that was more than enough. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden bathed in moonlight. Somewhere out there, people were reading her story. Somewhere out there, someone was finding the courage to stand up. Somewhere out there, a quiet woman was realizing she didn't have to stay quiet anymore. And Margaret smiled, because she'd done more than take back her house. She'd taken back her voice.
2 years after the betrayal, Margaret received a call she didn't expect. It was from Rachel. "Mom." Rachel's voice was quiet, tentative. "I know I have no right to ask this, but can I see you?" Margaret's first instinct was to say no, but something stopped her. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was growth. Maybe it was just exhaustion from carrying anger for so long. "Why?" Margaret asked simply. "Because I want to show you something," Rachel said. "Please, just once. If you never want to see me again after that, I'll respect it." Margaret thought about it for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay, but we meet in public." They met at a small park near the edge of town. Rachel was already there when Margaret arrived, sitting on a bench, her hands folded in her lap. She looked different, older, more worn. "Thank you for coming," Rachel said as Margaret sat down. Margaret didn't respond. She just waited. Rachel pulled out her phone and opened a photo. "This is my daughter," she said quietly. "Your granddaughter, Lily. She's 4. Margaret's breath caught. She'd known Rachel had a child, but she'd never seen her, never been invited into that part of her life. The little girl in the photo had curly brown hair and bright eyes. She was holding a stuffed rabbit and smiling at the camera. "She asks about you," Rachel said, her voice breaking. "She sees pictures of you at Grandma's house. Linda's been letting me visit her, and she always asks, 'Who's that?' And I don't know what to say." Margaret stared at the photo, her heart aching. "I can't undo what I did," Rachel continued. "I can't go back and be the daughter you deserved. But Lily, she deserves to know you, and I don't want my mistakes to cost her that." Margaret's hands trembled. "Why now, Rachel?" "Because I'm scared," Rachel admitted. "I'm scared that one day Lily will grow up and treat me the way I treated you, and I'll deserve it. But I don't want that for her. I want her to grow up knowing what real love looks like, and that starts with me making this right." Margaret looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and she saw something she hadn't seen before. Regret. Real, bone-deep regret. "I'm not ready to be in your life again," Margaret said slowly, "but maybe I could meet Lily, just once, and we can see where it goes from there." Rachel's face crumpled with relief. "Thank you, God, thank you." Margaret held up a hand. "But I need you to understand something, Rachel. This is about her. If you ever use her to manipulate me, if you ever put me in a position where I have to choose between my boundaries and my granddaughter, I'll walk away and I won't look back." Rachel nodded quickly. "I understand, I promise." Margaret stood, her legs shaky. "I'll think about when, but not yet." Rachel stood too, hope and sadness mixing on her face. "Okay, whenever you're ready." Margaret walked away, her heart pounding. She didn't know if she was doing the right thing, but she knew this. Lily was innocent, and Margaret had lost too much already. Maybe this was a chance to build something new, something healthier, something rooted not in obligation but in choice. Maybe. Or maybe it would fall apart. But at least this time, Margaret would go in with her eyes open, and her boundaries firmly in place. She wasn't the same woman who'd been taken advantage of 2 years ago. She was stronger now, wiser, and she would never let anyone, family or not, make her feel small again. 3 months later, Margaret met Lily for the first time. It was at a neutral location, a small ice cream shop in town. Rachel had suggested it, and Margaret had agreed. Margaret arrived early, her stomach in knots. She didn't know what to expect, didn't know if this would feel right or wrong, or somewhere painfully in between. But when Lily walked in, holding Rachel's hand, wearing a little yellow dress and clutching that same stuffed rabbit from the photo, Margaret's heart melted. "Lily," Rachel said gently, kneeling down, "this is your grandma Margaret." Lily looked up at Margaret with wide, curious eyes. "Hi." "Hi, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice soft. Lily smiled shyly. "Mommy says you like gardens." Margaret's eyes stung. "I do." "Me too," Lily said, brightening. "I have a sunflower. It's this big." She stretched her arms as wide as they'd go. Margaret laughed, the sound surprising even herself. "That's a very big sunflower." They got ice cream, chocolate for Lily, vanilla for Margaret, and sat outside at a small table. Rachel stayed quiet, letting them talk, and slowly Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Lily chattered about her sunflower, her stuffed rabbit, her favorite cartoons. She asked Margaret questions about the garden, about flowers, about whether butterflies had favorite colors, and Margaret answered every single one, her heart full in a way she'd forgotten was possible. At the end of the hour, Lily hugged Margaret tightly around the knees. "Can I see you again?" Lily asked. Margaret looked at Rachel, who nodded silently, tears in her eyes. "Yes," Margaret said, her voice thick. "I'd like that." As they left, Rachel turned back. "Thank you, Mom, really." Margaret nodded. She didn't say, "You're welcome," because she wasn't ready for that yet. But she also didn't say no, and that was progress. Over the next several months, Margaret saw Lily regularly. They planted flowers together, read books, drew pictures, baked cookies. Rachel was always there, always respectful, always careful not to overstep. And slowly, painfully, something began to heal. Not everything, not all at once, but something. One afternoon, while Lily was picking dandelions in the garden, Rachel sat beside Margaret on the porch. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Rachel said quietly, "but I want you to know I'm different now. I'm trying to be." Margaret looked at her daughter. "I can see that." Rachel's eyes widened. "Really?"
Yes, Margaret said, but Rachel, trying isn't the same as succeeding, and I need you to understand that I'm still protecting myself. I'm still cautious, and I might always be. Rachel nodded. I understand, and I don't blame you. They sat in silence for a moment, watching Lily laugh and spin in the grass. She's lucky to have you, Margaret said softly. Rachel's voice broke. I'm lucky to have you, even if it's just like this, even if it's just a little bit. Margaret didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. And that was enough. Because healing isn't linear. It's messy and complicated and full of setbacks. But it's also possible. And Margaret was learning that sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't to shut people out forever. It's to stay open, but protected. To give second chances, but not third or fourth ones. To love, but never at the expense of yourself. Margaret had built a new life, and if Rachel wanted to be part of it, she'd have to earn it. Not with words, with time, with consistency, with respect. And so far, Rachel was trying, and maybe, just maybe, that was a start. 3 years after the betrayal, Margaret stood in her garden on a warm summer evening, watching the sun dip below the hills. The tomatoes were ripe, the flowers were blooming, the air smelled like earth and growth and life. Lily was there, now 7 years old, crouched by the lettuce plants, carefully pulling weeds the way Margaret had taught her. Rachel was there too, helping Margaret hang fairy lights along the porch. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't the family Margaret had imagined, but it was real, and it was hers. David never reached out, not once. Margaret had heard through Linda that he'd moved to another state, still bitter, still blaming everyone but himself. Margaret felt sad about that, but she didn't chase him. Some people don't want to heal, and that's their choice. Linda visited occasionally. She'd rebuilt her life slowly, carefully. She'd started her own business, gone to therapy, and worked hard to prove she'd changed. Margaret still kept her at arm's length, but the door wasn't closed anymore. It was cracked open, just a little, and that was okay. One evening, after Lily had gone home with Rachel, Margaret sat alone on the porch with a cup of tea. She thought about everything she'd been through, the grief, the betrayal, the fight, the rebuilding. She thought about the woman she used to be, the one who believed family meant enduring anything, sacrificing everything, staying silent no matter the cost. And she thought about the woman she was now, stronger, wiser, unafraid. Margaret had learned something powerful over these years. You don't owe anyone your pain, not even family. You don't owe anyone access to your life, your peace, your home. Love isn't about obligation, it's about mutual respect. And if someone can't give you that, you're allowed to walk away. You're allowed to protect yourself. You're allowed to choose you. Margaret had done that, and it had cost her, but it had also saved her. She pulled out her journal, the one Robert had given her, and opened to a blank page. She wrote, "To anyone reading this one day, if you're being taken advantage of, know this. You're not crazy, you're not selfish, you're not wrong for wanting to be treated with dignity. Standing up for yourself doesn't make you a bad person, it makes you a strong person. Family is supposed to lift you up, not tear you down, and if they're doing the latter, you're allowed to let them go. It will hurt, God, it will hurt, but you'll survive. And on the other side of that pain, you'll find something beautiful, yourself. Don't let anyone take that from you, not even the people you love, especially not the people you love. Margaret." She closed the journal and set it on the table. The stars were beginning to appear, scattered across the darkening sky like tiny promises. Margaret took a deep breath and smiled. She'd lost so much, but she'd gained more. She'd gained her voice, her strength, her peace. She'd gained a life that was entirely, beautifully hers. And no one, No one could take that away. Margaret stood and walked to the edge of the garden where Robert's tomato plants still grew every year. She touched one of the ripe tomatoes gently, feeling its warmth. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." The breeze moved through the garden, soft and kind, like a hand on her shoulder, and Margaret knew deep in her bones that she was going to be okay. More than okay. She was going to thrive, because she'd learned the most important lesson of all. The quiet ones aren't weak. They're just waiting for the right moment to roar, and when they do, the whole world listens.
So that's Margaret's story. A woman who lost everything and took it all back. Not with violence, not with bitterness, but with quiet, devastating strength. She was underestimated, dismissed, erased, and she came back stronger. Here's what I want you to take from this. If you're going through something similar, if you're being manipulated, controlled, taken advantage of by people who are supposed to love you, you are not alone. And you are not powerless. You have options. You have rights. You have worth. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Margaret's story isn't just about revenge. It's about reclaiming yourself. It's about refusing to be erased. It's about standing up even when your voice shakes and saying, "No, not anymore." And if you know someone going through this, share this story with them. Let them know they're not crazy. Let them know there's hope. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remind someone that they matter. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation like Margaret's? Have you ever had to stand up to family? How did you find the strength? Drop your story in the comments. Let's support each other, because we're stronger together. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video. You never know who needs to hear it. Remember, never underestimate a quiet woman, because when she finally speaks, the whole world listens. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Stay strong, stay fierce, and never, ever let anyone make you feel small. You're worth more than that. Always.